Russia is a friendly country, but I do not accept machineries at our border. That was not a slip of the tongue. It was a trembling signal, broadcast live from the highest office in Algiers. What did President Abdul Majid Tebboune see at the southern frontier that shook him so deeply? And why now? He did not mention Mali. He did not name the African Corps. But the world heard the message loud and clear: this is not just about sovereignty. This is about fear. Fear of something growing beyond control. Fear of a military force that does not report to Paris or Washington. Fear of a fire in the Sahel that Algeria can no longer contain. For the first time in decades, a North African head of state looked south and blinked. And when a president flinches, you must ask, what power is rising on the other side of that silence? This is not a local skirmish. This is the echo of a new order, drafted in Bamako, blessed in Ouagadougou, and now enforced by men who move in shadows. If you believe Africa's hidden battles must be revealed, like, comment, and subscribe to join the front line of truth. Russia is a friendly country, but I, as the President of the Democratic and Popular Republic of Algeria, do not accept machineries at our border. The words were measured, but the message was urgent. President Tebboune never used the words African Corps. He never acknowledged the Mali AES counteroffensive. But his trembling voice told another story. In the language of geopolitics, silence is complicity. And half-sentences are sometimes confessions. Because what Algeria fears is not what's crossing the border. It is what has already crossed. It is not just military hardware, but a new kind of fire, born in Mali, trained by Africa, and guided by something far more terrifying than weapons. A will to finish what colonialism began. They move like whispers through the sand. No logos. No press briefings. No grand speeches. Just a mission. And when they leave, the desert is quieter. Not because they came gently, but because those who screamed last are now silent. Permanently. This is the African Corps. Not a militia. Not mercenaries. They are something else, a military shadow, cast by a new African sun. In the nights beyond Gao, near the dry breath of the Sahel. Reports began to emerge of precision raids. FLA camps, once protected by proximity to the Algerian border, were found, hit, and burned. There were no survivors to explain how it happened. Only ashes, bullet holes, and the occasional drone footage, too blurry to prove, too precise to doubt. At first, some said it was the Malians acting alone. But soon, the patterns emerged: coordinated night attacks. 0 casualties on the assault teams, and the unmistakable footprint of Russian tactical doctrine fused with local terrain mastery. It was not France. It was not the UN. It was something else. Something that began with a call from Bamako. And that call echoed not just through Mali, but through the halls of Ouagadougou, Niamey, and the growing chambers of the AES alliance. For the African Corps, Mali was not a mission. It was a crucible. Under President Assimi Goïta, Mali had severed ties with the French military command, expelled Western advisors, and turned toward something riskier: sovereignty. But sovereignty, like gold, must be forged in fire. And in Mali, that fire came in the form of FLA rebel groups, JNIM terrorist sects, and imported drones from Eastern Europe. They fought dirty, hiding in villages, using children as shields, and filming propaganda in languages spoken far beyond the Sahel. For a while. It worked. Until the night things stopped being filmed, and started being finished. When African Corps entered the scene, the war changed. No more daily press statements. No more measured diplomacy. Just smoke in the morning, and fewer enemies at sunset. They struck like a ghost with steel fists. A village used as a JNIM forward base, gone by dawn. A weapons cache hidden under a mosque, surgically extracted and neutralized. They left behind only questions. Questions Algeria did not want to answer. Questions France pretended not to hear. Questions the United States asked too late. Because this was not a cleanup crew. This was a vanguard, and it bore the seal of something larger. AES. 3 letters that now make generals in old capitals sweat. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, 3 nations once mocked as unstable, had done something terrifying: they stopped listening. They stopped waiting for development aid that never came. They stopped asking for approval from men in suits who had never walked their villages. And they started building with whatever they had. Traoré in Burkina Faso called it la voie souveraine, the sovereign path. And if Traoré was the philosopher, Goïta was the sword. The African Corps became the sharpened edge of this philosophy: don't wait to defend yourself. Don't beg for peace. Take it. Shape it. Enforce it. Some nights, they struck deep into territory once thought unreachable, cavern systems where rebel leaders held strategy sessions over maps printed in France. Loaded with gear marked property of foreign forces. In one raid, a field commander found a half-written speech, meant for broadcast in Algiers, the kind of statement the rebels would make to justify a new offensive. Blame the AES, and beg for international sympathy. They never finished that speech. But the message was clear: this wasn't just war. It was a message. A declaration. A map being redrawn in gunpowder. And Algeria, watching from across the line, suddenly realized that those maps had no borders left for them. This is why Tebboune spoke. Not because African Corps crossed into Algeria, but because reality crossed into his dreams of control. Because sovereignty, real sovereignty, doesn't ask for permission to act. It simply acts. And African Corps was acting with surgical precision. They knew the caves. They knew the tunnels. They knew the passwords and the lieutenants. Some said they had defectors working with them. Others said it was satellite intelligence from AES partners. But those were just theories. The only thing we knew for sure was the silence that followed. The silence of weapons buried. Of propaganda networks shattered. Of camps once full, now occupied by wind and vultures. This silence terrified those who thrived on chaos. FLA began fleeing into Algeria, where they hoped for sanctuary. But some never made it. Some were intercepted, mid-run, by men who did not exist on any government record. But whose bullets carried no diplomacy. They were not just eliminating enemies. They were eliminating options. And when you eliminate options, the game ends. At least for one side. And yet, despite all this, African Corps rarely speaks. There are no medals. No flags waving on victory hills. Just one message passed between their ranks. We do not fight for cameras. We fight so our children will not. That is the war Algeria fears. Not a war of invasion. But a war of ideas, backed by those who are willing to do what it takes. Because Mali is not just defending its land. Mali is proving a principle. And that principle now walks in boots, across sand, in the silence between borders. If you believe that courage without cameras is the truest kind, leave your voice in the comments below. This war is being fought in silence. Let your words be the echo it needs. It began with a sound, not a scream, not a gunshot. A mechanical buzz in the wind, barely above the rustling of thorny desert shrubs. Then a flash. Then silence. The first drone strike was not the deadliest. But it was the most revealing. The rebels were adapting. From hidden workshops in caves near Kidal to smuggling lanes through Libya. Azawad insurgents and JNIM operatives had begun fusing Ukrainian FPV drones with salvaged IEDs. The makeshift devices weren't elegant, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to hit once. And they did. One by one, Malian convoys moving north from Gao found themselves stalked by eyes they couldn't see. At first, the explosions came without warning. Then they came in patterns, always near canyons. Under heat distortion, timed with sniper fire. It wasn't just war anymore. It was desperation, coded into plastic wings. Azawad's last breath wasn't defiant. It was technical. The rebels had run out of men, so they turned to machines. They had run out of vision, so they borrowed it, through drone lenses paid for with foreign currency, routed through hands that never touched the Sahel. But no amount of tech could disguise the truth. This was not evolution. This was decay. The FLA, once hailed by Western analysts as a legitimate independence movement, had degraded into a loose network of narco-terrorist bands. Tribal opportunists, and mercenaries without uniforms or command structure. Their alliance with JNIM was not strategy. It was survival. And nothing proves desperation more than what they did next. They conscripted children. Thin-armed teenagers in oversized boots. Boys barely old enough to shave, holding rifles taller than their shadows. They weren't soldiers. They were shields. And they were being thrown into the teeth of a war they didn't start, and would never understand. This was not an army. It was a death cult on borrowed time. But time, in the Sahel, is cruel to the unprepared. At Aoc, they tried to make a statement. A convoy of 30 Malian military vehicles was en route to resupply a forward base when the ambush began. First came the drones. Then came the RPGs. Then came the sandstorm, almost as if nature itself had been weaponized. The FLA had bet everything on this moment. They filmed it. They planned a media release. But something shifted. The Malians were not alone. From the west came a formation of African Corps vehicles, silent and coordinated. From the sky came two Mi-35 helicopters, newly acquired. Flying low, loud, and merciless. The ambush became a trap. And the trap became a massacre. Hours later, drone footage showed the aftermath. Charred vehicles, scattered weapons. And a field that once whispered of rebellion, now soaked in silence. Among the dead were 6 foreign operatives, their faces unrecognizable, their gear unmistakably NATO surplus. And somewhere in a tent, half burned, they found a manifesto. Written in French. Signed, "For the liberation of Azawad." Its final line read, "If we fall, Algeria will shelter our sons." And that was the moment everything changed. Because it confirmed what many had whispered. That this war was not just tribal. Not just national. But geopolitical. A war where lines on maps meant less than the trails left by smugglers. A war where children were not the future, but the excuse. In the days that followed Aoc, the African Corps began hunting with renewed intensity. They weren't just chasing rebels anymore. They were chasing the networks. Supply lines through Tamanrasset. Encrypted radios pinging from just across the Algerian border. Thermal signatures from abandoned UN depots, now filled with rebel arms. And for the first time, the desert began to betray its secrets. Night raids increased. Captured prisoners spoke. And the narrative Algeria tried to suppress began to crack. Because the truth does not need permission to exist. The African Corps, silent, methodical, ruthless, was reshaping the battlefield not just physically, but morally. No more arguments about sovereignty. No more false balances between extremist and state. There was now only this question. Who stands for the people, and who hides behind them? And in that answer, Azawad was found wanting. The so-called liberation fighters had become traffickers of fear. They hid among women, launched rockets from clinics, edited their martyrdom videos in rooms once used to teach French grammar to school children. They were not liberating Azawad. They were looting its grave. Even international observers, previously neutral, began revising their tone. Reports no longer called them separatists. They were composite actors with jihadist tendencies. Diplomatic code for terrorists in borrowed clothing. But perhaps the greatest shift came not in the press releases, but in the eyes of Malians. Where once there had been uncertainty, now there was resolve. In marketplaces, people spoke of the African Corps with quiet reverence. They move like wind, said one shopkeeper in Douentza. But when they leave, the sand is clean. This is what fear looks like, not on the battlefield, but in the palace. It is why Tebboune, the president of Algeria, raised his voice. Not to condemn the violence, but to warn. Russia is our friend, but no machineries at our border. Machineries. Or memories. Because what the African Corps was bringing to the border was not just bullets. It was history, redrawn. It was justice, delivered without permission slips. It was the idea that Africa no longer needed foreign supervision to clean its own house. And that idea, for many in Algiers, was the real threat. Because it meant that the war was no longer just in Mali. It was at their doorstep. Not with flags or ultimatums, but with the quiet certainty of men who had nothing left to ask for. They didn't need approval. They needed one more night. One more map. One more radio signal. And then, silence. The kind that follows not just victory, but clarity. If you believe no child should be a soldier, and no desert should be a grave for freedom, stand with those who fight in silence. Like, comment, and share their story. Before the next strike is never seen. When does concern become hypocrisy? When a leader who welcomed foreign military trainers for decades suddenly raises alarms about machineries. President Tebboun's dilemma was not moral. It was geopolitical. For years, Algeria tolerated, even supported, the quiet flow of Western forces across its neighborhood. French commandos trained peacekeeping units in Mauritania. American drones flew low over the Sahel in search of shadows. UN troops rotated through buffer zones like interchangeable ghosts. Algeria said nothing. But now, with the arrival of African Corps, not under a blue helmet, not under NATO's gaze, a line was drawn. The question was never about who crossed the border. The question was, who crossed it without permission? Because Algeria, like many post-colonial powers, had grown comfortable managing instability, not solving it. Instability justified surveillance. It justified diplomacy. It justified arms budgets. But African Corps didn't come to negotiate. They came to terminate. And in doing so, they disrupted an entire industry of conflict management. Tebboune knew this. So he said the only thing left to say. Russia is our friend, but I do not accept machineries at our border. The phrase was carefully chosen. Machineries. Not troops. Border, not sovereignty. Because the truth, if spoken plainly, would sound like surrender. He could not say, I fear the war is ending, and I no longer control the outcome. He could not say, FLA fighters are losing, and some of them are hiding in my country. But he could say, no machineries. And in doing so, he exposed the quiet arrangement that many African leaders had come to rely on. Let instability simmer. Let the West send troops. Let the rebels strike occasionally, just not too close. Let the media report complex dynamics. Let the war stay unresolved. But African Corps, forged in the fire of AES sovereignty, was not built to preserve the problem. It was built to end it. And that, more than bombs, more than borders, is what frightened Tebboune. Because Mali, under Goïta, had made a decision. Burkina Faso, under Traoré, had made a declaration. And Niger, under Tchiani, had made a stand. Together, they were not just rewriting alliances. They were redrawing reality. A reality where Africa would no longer wait for permission to act. Where men like Traoré would no longer send requests, they would send units. Where sovereignty wasn't a slogan, it was a soldier with sand in his boots and no fear in his eyes. And in that world, the old logic of Algeria no longer held. You could not support anti-terrorism on paper while offering passage to its enemies in practice. You could not decry foreign interference while lobbying European powers behind closed doors. You could not claim neutrality while your border posts became safe havens for retreating militants. The African Corps didn't say these things. But their silence made them undeniable. Every camp they cleared, every drone they downed, every manifesto they captured, was a page torn from Algeria's diplomatic mask. And behind that mask, fear. Not just of the African Corps, but of what they represented. A force that did not ask. A coalition that did not kneel. An Africa that did not forget. And that force was gaining ground. Traoré's speeches, once dismissed as radical youth sermons, now sounded like declarations of doctrine. In Ouagadougou, his words were becoming law. In Bamako, they were becoming policy. And across the Sahel, they were becoming movement. Not because he had the biggest army, but because he had the clearest line. Sovereignty is not a gift. It is what you are willing to defend, with or without friends. This, Algeria could not copy. It could only fear it. Because if Traoré was right, then every compromise Algeria had made, every deal, every delay, every speech, was not strategic. It was surrender. And surrender, once exposed, is contagious. That is why Tebboune spoke. Not to warn the African Corps, but to warn his own people. To remind them who still held the microphone, even as the battlefield slipped from his grasp. But microphones can be turned off. And power, once outsourced, is hard to reclaim. So the dilemma remained. Would Algeria join the new order rising from AES? Or cling to the old scaffolding of influence, hoping the war would pause before it reached Algiers? History offers little mercy to the hesitant. As the sun sets over the Sahel, African Corps continues its march. Not for conquest. Not for applause. But for clarity. In a region long blurred by international interests. They offer something rare. A mission with no middlemen. And as they walk, the question grows louder. Who speaks for Africa? The one who signs foreign contracts? Or the one who clears his land with his own hands? If you believe sovereignty is more than just a flag, if it's a stand, a sacrifice, a silence that speaks louder than politics, then let your voice rise. Like, comment, and subscribe. Because the next chapter of Africa is being written now, not negotiated later. The border tells a different story. While official statements speak of neutrality and sovereignty, the sand between Mali and Algeria is marked with bootprints, and not all of them face south. Captured FLA fighters whisper of safe houses beyond the frontier, of weapons caches that were never listed. And of roads where drones disappear, not from malfunction, but from electronic jamming no rebel could afford. A recent raid revealed crates of ammunition labeled in Cyrillic, but manufactured in Eastern Europe, routed through third-party networks. Among the crates were drone parts. Scorched. Bent. But still traceable. Some bore inscriptions in Ukrainian. Others were marked with transit codes long associated with North African ports. The math was clear. What was falling on Malian convoys had traveled a very long way, and it did not walk there. It was not just technology. It was sanctuary. A quiet promise made across a border: if you fall back, you will not fall far. And so they ran. Not just foot soldiers, but commanders. Not just JNIM, but FLA. Not just criminals, but clients. Algeria denied it, of course. We do not support terrorism, the foreign minister said. But denial has never stopped gravity. And gravity, in geopolitics, pulls towards silence. Why else would rebels ambushed near Gao to flee north? Why else would intercepted radio traffic switch frequencies the moment it reached the edge of Malian airspace? Why else would Algeria, a state so publicly committed to regional stability, speak only when African Corps approached, but remain silent through years of French drone strikes and American surveillance? The answer lies not in what is said, but what is spared. Because African Corps doesn't spare. They don't negotiate with mayors, or meet with intermediaries. They don't make excuses for failed states or shifting alliances. They clear. And in doing so, they make no room for ambiguity. That is the real threat. Not to Algeria's territory, but to its logic. A logic that says, we can host diplomacy and shadow war in the same room. A logic that has allowed certain borders to become both walls and windows, depending on who is crossing. African Corps closed the window. And the smoke rising from their raids proved the door was next. So Tebboune protested. Not because his land was invaded, but because his illusion was. The illusion that Algeria could remain above the fray, as chaos paid quiet dividends below. But illusions crack when children carry rifles. They shatter when drones scream at midnight. And they die when the men you thought were pawns start fighting like kings. AES did not declare Algeria an enemy. But Algeria, by harboring those who sought to undermine AES sovereignty, made its position loud in silence. And when silence speaks louder than truth, soldiers listen. That is why African Corps does not retreat. That is why Mali keeps pushing. That is why Traore watches not just from Burkina Faso, but from history itself, measuring every compromise, every hesitation, every alliance left unspoken. It ends not with victory parades or televised speeches. It ends with silence. The kind of silence that only follows storms, the kind where breath returns to lungs that forgot how to hope. Azawad is not yet a memory. But it is no longer a threat. And Algeria? It must now decide whether to stand with the continent, or remain trapped behind its own reflections. Because what began as a skirmish on the edge of Mali has become something deeper, a redefinition. Of borders. Of alliances. Of courage. African Corps did not just fight men. They fought ideas. Ideas that said Africa was too weak to defend itself. Too fractured to unite. Too late to change. They proved otherwise. And if you followed this story, if you felt the tremor behind every bullet, every raid, every contradiction exposed, then you are already part of the resistance. The spirit of Traore, Goïta, and the Sons of Africa touched something in you. Like, comment, and subscribe. Not for them, but for what comes next. Because the final line of fire is not drawn in the sand. It's drawn in your will to remember, and to rise.